Hello, everyone. This is the 136th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 Letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview author Mr. Dominic Hougham as we discuss his book, 50 Great World Cup Matches and Why You Should Watch Them. Mr. Huffam has written for the likes of These Football Times and The Football Pink in the past. Welcome, Dominic. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Very good to be here.
Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
So, as you can probably tell from my accent, I grew up in England. I grew up in London, in South London. I think, like most people my age, I was one of those children that just played football all the time. So, we were those kids that played in the playground at lunchtime. We used to go to the park afterwards. So, I grew up surrounded by people who loved football, who played football. I grew up walking distance from Selhurst Park, the Crystal Palace ground. So when I was a small kid, my dad used to take me there all the time. I actually ended up being a West Ham fan purely because a friend of mine at school, his father was from the East End, and so he would take us to games in the kind of late 70s, early 80s, and I just fell in love with the team then. And I've been a fan the rest of my life. Sometimes I regret that decision because they don't exactly win a lot, but you make your bed and you have to lie with it. So I lived in London until around 1997. And at that time, I then moved to the States. I came over to Pasadena. My wife is American. So we moved over here and I've been living here ever since. I still do play football. As I say, when I was a young guy, I played at kind of kid level. I played at student level. I used to play Sunday league. And then when I came here now, I still do a pickup game every Saturday in La Canada, which is great fun, even at my age. And what's nice is it's a whole mix of people. So I've actually played with my 21-year-old son against me, which is kind of fun. I grew up, as I say, my dad was into football. My mother, as we'll talk about later, grew up in Brazil, so she was into football. So it was always a thing within the household. It was that time when we would literally, every break at school, we would go outside, we would play in the playground, we would play with a tennis ball, we would play after school, we'd go to the park. It was a lot more, now it's more obviously AYSO and more organized, which is good and bad, but we just spent a lot of time playing, and I just fell in love with the game and always have to this day. It's just always been my first passion.
So, what prompted you to write this book?
Well, firstly, I've always loved the World Cup anyway. I mean, again, I think it comes from when you're young, especially at my age, there wasn't a lot of live football on. So you have to remember nowadays you can watch football almost like 365 days a year. There's so much of it. But when I was a kid, there wasn't a lot. You got highlights maybe on a Saturday night, highlights on a Sunday, very, very few live games. Maybe some of the European games would be shown live, but very few. So when the World Cup came around, you had this month of just pure football being shown live. It was a huge deal, much bigger deal in a way than it is now because there's so much more football around. So
And if I may add, that was really the only time you would be exposed to international talent.
yeah, and as you know, a lot of the players, again, because of information now and the internet, you go into World Cup, you know most of the players and you know details about them. And if you don't, you can find them very quickly. Again, for us, when the World Cup came, part of the mystique was you didn't know who some of these players were. A lot of these players, I mean, if you looked at even somebody like Brazil in '82, we didn't really know who Zico or Socrates were. We hadn't seen them in England. You might see them occasionally on sports night playing for a European team, but that was about it. So they had that glamour. You would get the wall chart, you'd fill in the wall chart as it went along. You'd get your Panini sticker book, and that's how you would start to learn about some of these players. And I think also the World Cup had such a big influence on me because the other thing when you're young, especially, is you can watch every game. Now it's harder. I mean, the last World Cup that came, I got to watch some of the games, but other times you're working and you have family responsibilities. But I think everybody probably remembers their favorite World Cups as the ones when they're young because you could just sit there. It was the summer holidays and you could just watch every single game, didn't matter what it was. You could just gorge on it. And then the book came about really because I'd been writing for these Football Times, and it was during COVID. And I have two sons, and we were stuck for what to do. There was no football, obviously. So one day I just said, "Oh, we'll watch Brazil Italy," because it was you could watch the full game on YouTube. I said, "We'll watch Brazil Italy '82. It's this classic game. You're going to love this. This is one of the most amazing games of all time." So we sit down and watch it, and I kind of realized that they're like, it's a good game, but they couldn't see it in the same way as me because they didn't have the context. And it made me realize, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but it still made me realize if you don't have the context behind an old game, it doesn't really mean much to you. You know, watching Brazil Italy on its own doesn't mean a lot. You just think, yeah, it's a good game, 3-2, etc. But it made me realize that what they needed, and anybody who kind of is looking at World Cups before they really remember them, what you really need to appreciate the great games is the context. So that's the genesis of the book. I want to be able to say to them, hey, this is why this game is a great game. So when they're watching the highlights, it's like, okay, Brazil were this fantastic side going into it. Italy had been struggling, that sort of thing. So I wanted to get that across to them. And also because I think it's important, especially for World Cups before, as I say, before ones we know, to get that context. Even for me, I mean, if, as an example, if you said to me, Hungary, Germany, 1954, it's one of the great games. But again, I never saw it. I would need context. And it's only by just reading up on it that I've realized what an important game it is in life. So it was really it came from the boys of wanting to give them a guide and to also give them something to show where to start. Because again, if you want to jump into World Cup, it's a very big topic and there's a lot of games, and sadly there's a lot of disappointing games as well. So what I wanted to be able to say to somebody, especially if they were kind of getting into this, is, hey, look, I'm going to give you a guide. Here are some of the great games you should watch. You can go deep after that, but I don't want to put somebody off by saying just watch this World Cup and there's lots of nil-nils, etc. I wanted to be able to kind of give a taste and say, here are some things that hopefully will get you very passionate about it. And then, you can go off and discover more. But yeah, that's where the genesis came, was really seeing the kids' reactions to watching the Italy Brazil game and just realizing that, yeah, what we who saw it realize is a great game. You need the context to understand that. And that's what I try to do in the book, is explain the context and then also the effects of the game rather than just the game itself.
With that in mind, what was the research process like for this project?
Fun. It was fun. I mean, most of the research is going back to watching highlights or games. And I have to say, your highlights that you put on YouTube were invaluable. I knew about your initials way before I knew you, because I noticed that you were the source of many of the highlight reels, and they honestly are absolutely invaluable, because some of the games are, you have to go back to watch them. Some of the games are on YouTube in full, but a lot of them aren't, and you just hope that somebody's put on a good set of highlights. And sometimes they were in English, sometimes I was watching them in the native language, and they can actually be more fun, because you don't really need to understand everything that's in the commentary. But if you watch Brazil highlights commentated on by a Brazilian, or, for example, it gives you that spice and that flavor. So I went back and watched a lot of the games, and that was really, really fun to revisit them. And then what I would do is dig around the game to, as I say, the context of the game going into it, and then the effects afterwards. And some of it, I kind of knew the bones of what I wanted to say. But again, you start diving down rabbit holes and you find out stuff that you didn't know before, which is interesting. That's kind of where the trivia piece came from, where I put a piece of trivia on every game, was again, just because when you get into those rabbit holes, you start finding these really interesting things that you want to throw in there. And it's always fun to have a little bit of trivia backed on every game. So the research was really watching the game and then digging into kind of the surroundings and finding the stories and putting those in to give the full context. But a lot of 50 games, a lot of highlights to watch, a lot of fun.
You mentioned trivia. Can you discuss the format of the book? What makes it different from other material on this topic?
I think the difference is you get a lot of books that cover a specific World Cup. And probably each World Cup has been written about. I probably have a book on each of the World Cups. Now, those are fantastic. Don't get me wrong. I love them. But again, if you're slightly new to it, or they can be a bit intimidating, do you really want to dive straight into a World Cup, a whole book on a World Cup first time? So what I wanted to do, as I say, was give a kind of menu, a flavor of all of them, so that then people could move on from there and go deeper. 50 kind of worked out as the right number. When I actually sat down and penciled it, I started it from the first World Cup that I could faintly remember, which was 1974. And again, it's only very faintly, but I do kind of remember that World Cup being on.
So it was a conscious effort on your part to have the World Cups within your lifetime and your memory. Many of the 1970 World Cup matches are classics,
Yes,
but because you probably didn't experience it live, you didn't want to include it here.
exactly. I mean, I've watched Brazil, Italy, obviously 1970 since. But yeah, you don't have that same emotional link to it as you do to ones you actually remember. And it was funny enough, when I penciled them out, 50 games, it literally came out about 50 when I did the first draft of all the games, when I sat down and thought which ones I would do. I then deliberately put them in the book in chronological order. The big thing that I didn't want to do was to rank them, primarily because I felt, who am I to really say what's number one, what's number two, And also, everybody would have a different opinion. I didn't want to get down that rabbit hole. If you said to 10 people, rank your top 10 World Cup games, I'm sure everybody would give you a different answer. It's all subjective. And honestly, I don't even think I could do it. If you actually told me, sit there with 50 games and actually put them 1, 2, 3, 4, rank them, it would be extremely difficult to do. So I wanted to avoid doing that. I just put them in straight chronological order. But what I did do was call out what I would call obvious classics. So if you're talking to someone, again, Argentina, England, Maradona 86, most people are going to agree. Not everyone will agree maybe the order of the top 10, but most people will agree that's a classic that you have to see. There's certain games like that where they just stand out. So I did mark those as classics to kind of show the reader, hey, these are ones that in particular many people will talk about and you should probably know about and want to see. I wanted it to be more of a kind of tasting menu to start people off. And then hopefully what you do is you might say, the 82 World Cup, I really love those games. And then you can go to a book and there's a whole book on the 82 World Cup. And what was nice about it, I've been getting some reactions, and there was a friend who bought the book and he was like, yeah, I'm enjoying it. But what's funny, he said his 14-year-old picked it up and wouldn't put it down. He said he'd never seen him do that. And, it's nice. It's a mix of older people who experience some of these games, maybe not all. So they'll have some memories of some and learn about others. But it is really nice when you hear about like a 14-year-old picking up, a youngster doing it for the first time, because if you can get somebody who isn't hooked into football, hooked through the book, then hey, I've done my job. That would be fantastic. So that's why I went for that format, because as I say, there are detailed books on each World Cup. There's even books on specific games in the World Cup that you can read. But I wanted to give more of a tasting menu, let people kind of get an overview, and then, as I say, they can go and dig deeper if they wish.
For every match, you present the context, as you mentioned earlier, before discussing the match itself, and then the aftermath. And then you include trivia. How did you decide on this format?
I say, because I think, to me, the most important part of the book is the lead in, so the context of the game, and then the aftermath. Because I will describe each game and I go into detail, and I try to do it in a way where, I mean, it's small little things, but I'll put the score at the end so that if you're reading it for the first time, you don't know the score to the end, because I hate watching a game when I know the score. And I've tried to do the commentary kind of as exciting as I can to get the person really hooked into it. But, in effect, after that, they can go off and watch it on YouTube. Fine. So to me, the most important part is the events leading into it and the aftermath. So that's why I went for that format, because if you take, as we were talking about, Brazil, Italy, 82 as an example, again, the most important part to me to get over to the person who's going to watch it is you have to understand Brazil 82. So what I talk about is the team and how they've done this European tour before, and beaten, I think it was France, Germany, and England. I remember going to the England game and watching them win 1-0. Zico scored. So they'd got this buzz going about them, again, because we didn't know too much about them, but we'd seen them on this European tour. And suddenly they come to the World Cup, and in a group stage, they were just playing fantastic football, out of this world. Zico, Socrates, Adair, Falcao, and the world fell in love with them. Italy were kind of the opposite way. They were struggling when they came into this game. Paolo Rossi couldn't score for Toffee. He technically almost shouldn't have been in the World Cup because he'd been banned after one of the Italian betting scandals and was supposed to be out, but they let him back a year early so he could play. So you need that context again going into a game. So when you go and watch Brazil Italy, you realize, okay, Brazil, this fantastic team, everyone's rooting for them, they're playing beautiful football, they're the favourites to win the World Cup. Italy, they're doing what Italy often do, they're struggling in the group stage. Paolo Rossi is just a ghost. The Italian media are all over them, saying that they're picking the wrong team, etc. Rossi shouldn't be playing. And then when you watch the game, it all clicks into place. Okay, that's Brazil and how they play. And that's Italy, Paolo Rossi scoring a hat-trick. That's why it's such a big story about him scoring a hat-trick, because, say, technically he shouldn't have even been playing. And then the aftermath. So again, if you use that as an example, Italy go on to win the World Cup. Brazil have a complete rethink of how they play. Suddenly the beautiful game, it's not how they're going to approach it anymore, or they are, but they're going to temper it because they've learned from that game. They've realized that just playing full out attacking football, you needed a draw, you were drawing, and you still decided to go attack to try and win, and left yourself open to lose. So again, that's why I went for that, the aftermath. So when you watch Italy, Brazil, you know why going into the game it was so hyped, and the kind of background of the two, and then you realize the effect that it had on football, and especially on Brazilian football. And as I say, if you armed with all of that, then hopefully you appreciate the game a lot more. And again, as I say, it's like games that I hadn't seen. There's things like Germany-Hungary from 1954. Again, if I watch that now, I wouldn't really understand it. But again, by doing research into context and aftermath, you realize why that's such an important game in history. And it just gives you a lot more fulfilling knowledge on the game. So that's why I went for that format. I hope it works. And then trivia is always fun to put in a bit of trivia anyway. It's just some kind of fun fact. But that's why I decided to go that way.
What was your criteria to narrow down the list? What are the factors that make a match memorable?
So many. There's the obvious answer, which is the kind of high-scoring back and forth games. So if you think about the World Cup final we just had, the France-Argentina game, that's a classic example. 1-0, 2-0, 2-1, 2-2. They're those kind of thriller games, the 4-3s, the 3-2s. Some of those definitely merited being included. Then you have the ones where I'd say you have the drama or the controversies. So, like, for example, 1978 Argentina-Peru is in the book. Now, that's a 6-1 win. It's not exactly a close game or 3-2, a high back and forth game, but the whole conspiracy theories surrounding the game are very, very interesting. The whole Argentina knowing what they had to do because Brazil had played earlier, so that game has always lived on in infamy. England Argentina, the '86 Maradona one, is obviously a classic example of that. The game itself, when you watch it, isn't that great a game, but it has the most amazing 5 minutes with the hand of God, and then probably one of the greatest goals ever scored. Another good example of that is South Korea, Italy, 2002. Again, probably not a great game, but an incredible game in terms of controversy and drama, especially if you're Italian. And again, started about 1,000 conspiracy theories after. So there's those kind of games where they're more infamy, but they're very important in World Cup history. You have the political games. So good couple of examples of those. East Germany, West Germany. East Germany, West Germany was a 1-0 game. It's not outstanding, but in the political climate of 1974, seeing East Germany, they'd never really played each other, and seeing East Germany beat West Germany, that was a huge result. You could say the same for USA-Iran. USA-Iran in '98. Again, not exactly a classic game, but a game that merits interest because, again, the political surroundings of the game. There's a lot of history between Iran and USA going into that match. So you have those kind of games. Then I'd say there's the kind of golden generation games. So ones where you don't realize at the time, but later you're seeing a team that's just in its perfection at that time. And it can be quite fleeting. So that's why for 1974, everyone would probably always include a Holland game because you're watching total football, you're watching Cruyff. Again, it's important for the history of football because you realize that Dutch team changed the way football was played. They were amazing side, kind of less heralded, but another good example of that would be there's a game in the book, obviously, for Denmark in 1986 because of Danish Dynamite. So again, a once in a lifetime kind of generation that was really fun to talk about. Okiar and Olsen and all of those players. So those are, I think, are very important to have in the list. They're not always the great classic games, but you want to talk about those teams because they were such fantastic teams and educate people on those. And then I'd say the last category is the ones that I would call guilty pleasures, which are the ones where it all just goes off. And I know we're always supposed to be football purists, and I know we're supposed to love the game, but I've never met anyone who doesn't secretly love one of those games where it just completely degenerates. So there's a good example in the book is the one that was nicknamed the Battle of Nuremberg, which is Portugal, Netherlands in 2006, where it's just some record-breaking amount of yellow cards, red cards, just chaos all over the field. I mean, if you're going to go chaotic, go full scale. Those are games that, as I say, most people would admit there's a guilty pleasure, even if it maybe isn't Brazil, Italy, 1970. They're fun to watch. Those are kind of the classifications that I would use. The thrillers, the political ones, the golden generation, controversial ones, and then, as I say, the occasional game where it just all goes off.
Just out of curiosity, were there matches that you can mention that just missed a cut?
That's a tough one, actually. The only one I can remember off the top of my head debating and humming and ahhing about was Argentina-Croatia in 2018. I remember that being a really good game. Croatia beat Argentina 3-0. I remember thinking about that one and should that be included. But otherwise, as I say, it was kind of strange when I penciled it out. The 50 worked pretty well. I can't think of any other games where I had a lot of kind of heartbreak about not putting it in. I do remember that one, thinking if I could fit that one. And I think when I did the initial first draft, I had it as 51 with that one, and then had to decide which one to drop and decided on that one. So that's why that one sticks in my mind. That's the only one I can think of off the top of my head that I remember specifically having in the list and then dropping.
Reading through your list, there are obviously the matches that are part of football history, like the aforementioned 1982 Brazil Italy match. Now, what is the common link that still makes these types of matches classics despite the passing years and decades?
That's a good question. I think the passing decades actually is what makes them classics. The longer the time goes on, the more you appreciate certain games. And it's weird because certain games just almost take on an awe of being a classic, and don't know how to explain it. They just if you call a game a classic enough and you read it's a classic enough, you know what I mean? It almost becomes a classic. The best example I can think of is if you think about the Premier League, if you say to most people my age, what's the greatest Premier League game? Everybody will say Liverpool Newcastle,
Oh, yeah.
4-3 game. Now, people will say it even if they haven't seen it. It's just one of those almost commonly known facts that you've read so many times that it's called a classic that it just burrows into your head that it is a classic. And I think the World Cup has certain games like that. I think Brazil Italy has become one of those games from '82. It's almost, you wouldn't dare not call it a classic. It's just everybody just has accepted that it is. And as I say, as time passes, I think you appreciate it more. So, you know, Argentina, England, I would say the Maradona one, everybody would count that as a classic game, because it's still something that's written about. It's still, Maradona is still a huge thing to write about. The Hand of God is known to almost everybody. Again, even if you're not a football fan, you know what Maradona did in that game, and you've probably seen his second goal, probably the greatest goal ever in a World Cup. Denmark, Uruguay, ones like that where, again, it's a golden generation. So that goes down as a kind of classic because everybody who then remembers that Danish team will always talk about that certain game. That great game in the '86 World Cup when Denmark just showed why they were so fantastic. And again, that becomes a bit of a hipster thing, and it just becomes one of those hipster classic games. And then I think it's just emotional. So again, depending on who you are, I mean, speaking as somebody who's English, and if you speak to anybody, again, my age who's English, they're all going to say West Germany, England in 1990 is a classic game. Now, if you watched it and you're not German or English, it was a good game. I don't know if you would totally call it a classic. But as I say, depending on point of view, if you are English and you lived through that, that is ingrained in your memory as being one of the greatest games ever. Gaza, the emotion, and almost getting to a World Cup final. So I think emotion plays a lot into it for each country. So certain countries will have classics based on what they remember. But yeah, I mean, I think nostalgia definitely builds into it. The longer you get from a game, I mean, the most recent one I can think of that I think everybody would highlight would probably be the Germany-Brazil, that 7-1 game. Has already gone down as a kind of classic game, even though that was 2014. But I think, like, if you look at 2022, 2018, there's some great games, and I think they will go down as classics in time, but they don't do it straight away. It's that, as I say, it's that time, the building of time that really then shows which games, because it almost filters them. So suddenly after 20 years, it's like, well, which ones do you really remember? And it's those ones that are great games, the ones that stick even after 20, 30 years. You need that time to prove almost that it is a classic game. Plus, you need to see, the more games you see, the more you appreciate the classics, because it's like anything. If you just saw 4 classics, you wouldn't understand. But you have to sit through, I think, a lot of dross to really appreciate then when a great game comes along. Again, it's like anything. The more experience you have, the more you've seen, then you really realize when you watch a game that, oh, holy crap, this is a great game, because you've watched so many around it.
There are also matches that one might not always mention in such lists, such as the 2006 Australia Japan match, or the 2010 France South Africa, or even the 2018 Germany South Korea. What makes these particular matches stand out for you?
I'll take them in order. 2006 Australia Japan. What I wanted to do there was, because you realize as you start doing it, so many of the classic games are kind of Germany, England, France, Brazil, Italy. And the World Cup isn't just those games. So, yeah, I wanted to highlight that sometimes it's those games you don't expect that can be really great games. And Australia, Japan to me was one of those examples. It's two countries who aren't known for their, not renowned for their footballing prowess. They haven't won anything. And yet, they're not a superpower in footballing terms. And it might have been one of those games that going into it, you'd think, oh, Australia, Japan, I don't really need to watch that one. But the beauty of the World Cup is that some of these smaller teams can surprise. That's what's fun about it. And if you go back to the game, it was 1-0 to Japan with something like 6 minutes left, and then Australia scored 3 times to win the game. I mean, it was a very exciting match and very incredible ending. And again, it all depends on perspective. I mean, you and I might say, okay, is that necessarily a classic match? If you're Australian, to you, that is totally a classic match. It's one of the greatest games you've probably ever seen if you're an Australia fan. So again, it depends on context, but it was nice to kind of get in one that shows that it doesn't always have to be an Italy, Germany, or France, Spain to be a great game. There can be great games between sides that are less fancied. France, South Africa, I put that in because it was such a historic World Cup anyway. It was the 2010. It was the first World Cup to be held in Africa. Very emotional, putting it in South Africa. And so for South Africa to come out there and beat, as a host nation, an unfancied host nation, to beat France, who had been the finalists in 2006, only losing to Italy on penalties, that was a major shock at the time. I mean, that was a huge deal. And huge for African football. They get to host the World Cup, and then the host nation goes and beats France. So that was pretty seismic. And then it's a fun World Cup game, and one that should be talked about because of all the craziness that was going on with the France squad at the time. So that's one where, again, the game's important, but the context around it was pretty incredible. There's the whole implosion of France, basically going out on strike during their training games, the whole feud with Dominic. They got knocked out of the group stage. So that one I put in because of that, because it was such a seismic shock of South Africa beating them, and such a cool thing that they beat them, in their own, hosting the first World Cup in Africa. And then Germany, Korea. God, I remember watching the end of this one in a hotel. I was traveling, and we caught the last 10 minutes of the game. It's a fantastic 10 minutes. And most of the bar was full of Germans. We were in an airport hotel somewhere. It was really funny to watch. But yeah, the great thing about that was, if you remember the game, Germany was killing Korea, and they just could not score. They had so many shots and chances. And it was one of those classic ones where Korea go and score 2 games in stoppage time, completely reverse the match. And it was the first time Germany had ever been eliminated in the group stages. And again, for people of my age, and for most people, that doesn't happen to Germany. Yes, if you're young, and you've seen Germany in recent years, you might not realize why that was a surprise. But if you're our age, Germany being knocked out in a group stage was a huge thing. I mean, that just never, as I say, never happened. You always expected them to at least get to kind of quarterfinal, semi-final. That was Germany. So that one was a pretty big shock at the time, especially to the German nation. I mean, as I say, it just never happened. So that's why I picked those 3, for example. I think it's nice to get ones that aren't just, as I say, the superpowers. It's nice when you get somebody like a host nation. Saudi Arabia did to Argentina in the last World Cup. They weren't a host nation, but it was being hosted in the Middle East. It's nice when one of those stories happens. And as I say, sometimes the context of a game, as I say, the France one with the whole implosion that was going on in the French squad was pretty incredible news at the time. And yeah.
Are there matches on your list that your opinion of them has increased upon research and learning more about the context?
Yeah, 2 would come to mind. One of which I first of all picked just because of a score, and then the more I got into it, the more I actually realized what a great game it was. And that was the 86 Belgium Soviet Union. So it's a game that ended 4-3 to Belgium. So it's a fantastic game, end-to-end stuff. But what I hadn't realized until I really went into it was how good that Soviet Union side was. And if they hadn't have actually got eliminated, they had a very good chance of winning that World Cup, and they could have been contenders. It was fascinating because it was basically a Dynamo Kiev team. It was almost all comprised of players from Dynamo Kiev, who were a fantastic team in the 80s, and who kind of one of those that hipsters love. And I watched footage of them, and they're pretty incredible. And they were managed by Lobanovsky, who's one of the most famous coaches in terms of how football is played, along with Venus Meekles. He's kind of up there with them. So yeah, the more I watched that, the more I realized how good that team was. They had Kuznetsov, they had Rats, they had Elenikov, Belanov. Belanov hits a hat trick in the game. So that one was definitely one where it wasn't just that it was a 4-3. The more I got into it, the more I realized how great this Soviet team was. Because for the context of the game, I obviously went through their games leading into this, just realized how good they were. Another one that was interesting to revisit, because I remember watching it very well and through certain rose-coloured spectacles, was England-Cameroon. So that's the one where England beat them in the quarterfinals, I think it was 3-2. And I remember watching it and being slightly stressed. I mean, watching it in a crowded pub in London. But it's one of those where you watch it now and you realise how close England did come to losing, how good Cameroon were. Yeah, it's kind of in history, it's gone. The English think of it as, yeah, it was tough, we got through it, fine, whatever. And then they think about England, Germany. When you watch that game, Cameroon really did deserve to win. I have to say it. They were the better team, and we got lucky. We got two penalties. So that one definitely went up in my estimation. Cameroon were very, very impressive in that game. England were quite lucky to get through it. The other thing I think it helped to crystallize was there's views on games, there's also views on the tournaments. What was interesting was when I finished it, I kind of went back through and I realized, like, okay, how many games have I called classics in the World Cup? And when I kind of weighed it all up, it changed my views. Like, again, probably biased because of being that golden age when you can watch them all, but I found that 82 and 86 stuck out most for me in terms of just great World Cups. 1990, which I remember as a really great World Cup because of the England run and the emotion and the fact that it's been played in Italy and all of that. When I went back and went through games and tried to pick games that were classics, it was not a great World Cup.
Yeah, that's
So,
a popular topic on our podcast, the 1990 World Cup, because, like you said, it's taken a mythical proportion for English population. However, for most contemporaries, it was
yeah,
at the time it was considered a very poor World Cup.
yeah.
That's
And you go back to it and you watch, I mean, the England group stage was horrible. You know, they had the game against Egypt that they only won 1-0. But I just remember the Republic of Ireland game, the Egypt game, the Holland game, and there were some dire ones. I
oh
mean, I have a friend who's Irish, and he was joking. He was like, "Why didn't you put Ireland Romania in the book?" And I said, "Because it was a fantastic night. I remember in London getting very drunk with Irish people because they beat Romania, but it was an awful game. It was horrible. 0-0 went to penalties. So yeah, you realise that how sometimes your views of the World Cup have been skewed. The other one that hit me on that was 94. I have to say, 94, I remember being very cynical about, as probably most English words. Oh, it's going to be in USA. USA don't know anything about football. And I was actually on holiday in the USA when it was on, so I didn't see a lot of it. But going back and looking at that, that was actually a really, really good World Cup. Again, it gets tainted by the fact that the semi-finals and the final were awful, well, the final especially, which is what happens if you're going to play a game at midday in the Rose Bowl in June. A bit unfair. But if you actually look at the games before the semi-finals, some fantastic matches and a really, really good World Cup. Again, one where preconceptions, kind of like Qatar, people, you almost went into that World Cup, I think a lot of Europeans wanting not to like it, almost wanting the USA to fail in hosting it. And they did a brilliant job. They had the biggest crowds they'd ever been. And some, as I say, some really great games. So yeah, you find yourself as you do something like this, reassessing certain tournaments and discovering sides like that Soviet Union side where you may have kind of missed it at the time. I mean, again, I was fairly young at the time, so it probably didn't hit me how good they were. But doing the research on it, I hadn't realised how they were connected to that Dynamo Kiev side that I do love so much. So yeah, there were fun things like that where you discover games like those.
naturally we have to mention the important role of television. Virtually all these matches are regarded as classics due to its role. Are you conscious of that, and can you describe its importance?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, TV is obviously important. It adds glamour to the game. I mean, as a kid, I can remember listening to games on the radio because a lot of them weren't shown live. And it's fun to listen to on the radio, but it's not the same. And I think, as we were saying, that 1990 is a great example of that. I mean, you remember the 19 World Cup because of the fact that it was kind of the first modern World Cup. It had those really cool graphics. If you're English, it had Nessun Dorma on the TV, you had Des Lynam. So it definitely provides a context that in your mind for the matches. I think, again, a really good example for me as a small kid was the first World Cup I really remember is 1978. And probably the biggest reason I remember it is because of the ticker tape in Argentina. That's my overriding memory as a young child is just, oh my God, there was this ticker tape flying everywhere, and Mario Kempes with his hair blowing through the air, and Argentina. That's what sticks in your mind, especially as a youngster. 2010, you had the South Africa with the Buzazela. You know, love it or you hate it, but it was part of the experience that you get from TV. And it's just, yeah, certain moments like the last World Cup, that Japan was the ball over the line, was it not incident? Again, you need TV for that to be able to have all the angles and get into it all. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely improves the experience to watch it on TV. And I think there are certain images from TV that then stick with you. I think, as I say, 78 for me is the best example because I really remember that ticker tape. 90, I always, if I hear Nessun Dorma, it immediately just sends me straight back to that because of it being on TV. And those cool graphics and the cool Italian stadium that they had. Again, you know, England in the 80s was a pretty depressing thing. And so suddenly you're watching these games in the San Siro and it's this huge spaceship in the middle of that. It's just incredible. So yeah, I mean, visuals are very important. Again, the Brazil Italy 82 game, a lot of people will talk about the fact that it was in a small stadium, it was absolutely packed in to add to the atmosphere. You know, it wasn't in a big bowl. So yeah, TV, it shapes the way you remember the World Cup. The coverage, the TV coverage will shape the way you remember it, I think.
There are matches on your list from the 2018 and 2022 World Cups that are still fresh in our minds. And with the omnipresence of the media, we forget how important these matches were in the moment. Was that your feeling as you watched these particular matches in the moment, or was it only upon reflection that you valued their importance?
I'd say it was a mixture. I mean, it's the only time where I have in two simultaneous games. It's a 2020, which was the Japan, Spain, and the Germany, Costa Rica ones. Those I just remember as just thrilling at the time. You knew that was going to be a kind of classic thing. We were watching it at work. We had one of the games on the TV, and then when we realised all the craziness going on, we had another game set up on the laptop, and you were trying to watch the two games at the same time. I mean, that was a great advertisement for the group stages and why they should keep a 4-team group stage because it was just literally changing by the minute. You know, 1 minute Germany and Spain were actually for about 5 minutes. Germany and Spain were both going to be eliminated. So that did feel very seismic at the time. Obviously, the final, you knew as that game went further and further that you were watching a great game, especially is because I tend to be cynical before finals because a lot of times finals aren't great games. Not surprisingly, they're very cagey and neither team wants to make a mistake. So when you actually see a final go off like that, then you know that that's going to be a classic, and that will hold the test of time definitely. And then the Belgium Japan game, I remember being pretty thrilling at the time when Belgium did that last minute break to steal the game. But yeah, there were some in hindsight. I mean, the other thing as you get older is you can't watch all the games. So there were certain games where, I mean, like Saudi Arabia, Argentina, obviously a fantastic game in that Saudi Arabia beat Argentina. I didn't get to watch it at the time. I had to watch it with highlights later. So that colors your view slightly again, is whether you actually see it. Yeah, if you're watching it live, like the Japan Spain one, you really get into it. If you're watching highlights later, you realize it was a great game, but it doesn't have the same resonance. But I would say those two group games going on at the same time and Argentina France final were the ones where at the time you immediately knew that those were going to be talked about for a long time. Again, it depends how you see them, I think has an effect as well. And the trouble is you can't see all of the games. So sometimes you are relying on the highlights. But yeah, those two would stick in my mind as ones that would be 10 years, 20 years from now, people would still be talking about.
Which matches on your list you wish you could have experienced them watching live? On the list,
Uh,
or even maybe not off the list, like for pre
oh,
1970.
God. Definitely some of the finals pre. So again, it's fun doing research back into old games that were way before you were born. But the 1950 final, Uruguay Brazil, the big shock, the Maracanazo, would have loved to. I can imagine that would have been amazing to watch at the time because Brazil were just so expected to win that match, and it was such a shock for them to lose, in Rio at the Maracanã. That one, and then the one right after. Again, it was another example of that. The '54 one between Germany and Hungary. I mean, that Hungary side, by all accounts, was amazing. I think they lost something like one of 43 games in a row, and it happened to be that game in the final. So that would have been incredible to see. Being an English person, England West Germany, the 4-2 '66 final would have. I can imagine if you were watching that in England, would have been an incredible experience. The '70 final, yeah, obviously the '70 final. I've watched it. I have watched the whole game on YouTube, but to watch that live, to see that Brazil team in full flow against Italy when you didn't know what was going to happen and you just watched them absolutely crush them and play this beautiful football. I can imagine that must have been a very emotional moment, a very eye-opening moment. Probably the semi-final as well, the Italy-Germany semi-final, one that they always call one of the greatest games. Yeah, the one that
The match
had
of the
the crazy
century.
extra time. Yeah, the one that was 1-1. Well, it was a late equaliser by Germany, and then this insane extra time. So those ones I would definitely have loved to have seen. Since '74, I think I saw most of the classics on the list. There would have been some, obviously, where I would have seen highlights at the time, but most of the ones that I marked as classics, I probably did see.
Upon reflection, is your judgment of a particular match in your list impacted because you witnessed it within your lifetime? Does that play part?
Definitely, definitely. Yes, there's certain games because you're watching them live. I think back when we go through them. So '78 Scotland Netherlands would definitely be one of those because I was a fairly young kid and England weren't at the World Cup, and there was all this hype on British TV about Scotland and Ali's army and all of that. And I just remember, and then Scotland did their classic, messed everything up. They were going out, they were crashing out there to play Holland, and then in typical Scotland style, I remember watching this live. They actually got to a point where they were one goal from being able to qualify, and then of course it all imploded again on them. I remember that. The '82 Italy Brazil, definitely remember because my mother grew up in Brazil. My dad's English, but my mother grew up in Brazil. And so from a young age, she kind of gave me this love of Brazilian football. And she would get very, very emotional when Brazil played. She wouldn't really watch football too much otherwise, but she would watch every single Brazil game. And watching that match, I just remember her being heartbroken. And I was heartbroken at the time. I really, really want. It took me a long time before I could write articles where I said things like Italy were deserved winners. And they were. And I've written that in articles since. I've said, it's unfair that everybody demonizes Italy about that game because they just happened to win. That's what they were there to do. But so many people love that position. And I do remember sitting downstairs watching that and just being gutted by that defeat. And my mother, she was just in a horrible, foul mood for about 4 days afterwards. And the other one in that World Cup that really impacted me, again, I think because when you're young, they impact you more, was the West Germany France game. Because West Germany went into that already as kind of the villains. They'd had that whole disgrace of Hougham match. So they were kind of not loved. France had started shakily, but were playing really, really well. And I loved Platini as a kid. I thought Platini was a fantastic player. They had him. And it was first game where I think I realized that injustice can exist in football. You start off with this kind of innocence that the beautiful team will always win and everything's fair and it's like a Disney movie. And then you realize when you watch a game like that life isn't fair. The whole Schumacher incident and then France going up in extra time. I so wanted France to win that game. I think that's what they did. And yet Germany do what Germany do. They ground the Mac and they beat them on penalties. I just remember feeling after that what this shouldn't be allowed to happen. This is unfair. Life is unfair. So that one impacted me a lot. I remember live. And then probably the other one would be the West Germany England '90 game because, as I say, I remember watching that in a very crowded bar. And it's just one of those memories that will stick with me always, and why that game will always seem great to me because we had Gaza. It was such a close game. I still think that Germany goal was one of the luckiest goals ever. And that impacts you. And I remember the atmosphere in the bar during the game. Everybody was so up for it. And then that horrible moment when the last penalty misses and you see a whole crowded bar, just the whole atmosphere just dies in 2 seconds. It just goes from elation to just death in the bar. So I would say those ones probably had the biggest impact on me watching them live. I'd probably say France, Germany had the biggest one because I just couldn't comprehend at that age that something like that could happen. It's like, hey, welcome to football.
Which matches on your list do you feel are underrated and should be required viewing and reassessed?
I would say the Denmark Uruguay game from 1986, the 6-1 Denmark win. Now, they were playing against 10 men for quite a while, but that, if anybody really wants to understand why people rave about that Danish team and just how good they were, watch that game because you'll get an understanding of why they became the hipsters' favourite at that time and why they're still talked about with such reverence. I would say that definitely is one to revisit that might not be on people's radar. I would say the USA World Cup, the Romania Argentina game. Again, people don't really realize about Romania and Hadji. Just watch that match. It's a fantastic match anyway. Played in blistering heat at the Rose Bowl at a pace that shouldn't have happened. But you just get to, probably people don't even realize that Romania had a great team at one World Cup. And you watch that and you watch Hadji at his best and you've got Batistuta playing for Argentina. That is a game that, again, may go under the radar that I would tell anybody to watch. And then maybe the Uruguay Ghana, just because of that last 5 minutes. I think the interesting thing about that game and why people should watch that if they haven't seen it is the moral dilemma. And I remember this being a big thing for about a week afterwards. Yeah, it's the one where Suarez handballs on the line in the last minute. So literally one of the last kicks of the game, Ghana, it's going in the goal. They're going to win the game. He handballs it deliberately, saves it, and it goes to a penalty. He gets sent off. Goes to a penalty, and the Ghanaian misses, and then they end up losing on penalties. And it became this huge moral debate of, is Suarez evil? How could he crush Africa's dreams by doing that? But then you also realized, but what if he was on your team? Would you have done the same? And it became this very, very interesting moral argument. Like, would you have done the same? Would you cheer for him if he was on your team doing that? Or are you looking at it from Ghana's point of view? And of course, everybody wanted Ghana to win because they're the underdog and they would have been the first African team to reach the semi. So that one's an interesting one when you watch it because I think it does make you can have a really good discussion between you about the morality of that and the rights and wrongs and whether, I mean, he got punished as you said. The referee did exactly the right thing, sent him off, and they happened to miss. So there was nothing wrong about it or technically wrong, but it's just the morality of football. You can have a good discussion once you watch those clips. So I would say, yeah, those ones I would stick out to me.
And I think you may have touched up on this, but getting back to the importance of the context, there are matches that may not have been aesthetically pleasing, but have become classics due to the context. Can you mention some of these? I mean, you already mentioned the Holland Portugal in 2006, but can you think of others?
Yeah, because we talked about the political ones. So we said about USA, Iran, and East Germany, West Germany. And then all ones like, I think we mentioned it earlier, but the Argentina England game, as I say, the 86 Maradona one was a pretty dull game when you actually watch it, apart from the 5 minutes of Maradona. So that's, again, a kind of context one because it's not a great game, but it's probably one of the most famous games because of those 5 minutes.
I could add Argentina Cameroon, the 1990 World Cup opener.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. The shock of that. and I think that's still one of my favorite red cards of all time, just because, I mean, again, it sounds cynical, but if you're going to foul somebody, do it in style. And the fact that they kind of when Caniggia was running, I think two of them had a go at him and missed him, and then the third person just completely barreled into him and lost his boot doing it. I'm like, it's you can't help it. It is funny. One of those great things. I think probably one we didn't mention was again Germany, the Germany Brazil 7-1. In a way, it's not a classic because it's just one team hammering the other, and it was all over by half an hour. I think it was like 5-0 after half an hour or whatever. So in a way, yeah, it wasn't a great game. It wasn't a contest. It was almost painful to watch. I remember it was like watching a car crash. You just almost wanted to turn away. But that's another context one because it was such a seismic result and it was being played in Brazil as well in front of their home fans. That's a classic example, one where, yeah, it was completely one-sided and there wasn't any jeopardy in the game from very early on. But you were glued to it because it's like, oh my God, I can't believe this is actually happening before our eyes. And it just kept getting worse and worse.
I would also add the 2002 World Cup opener, France-Senegal. That also may not have been a particularly good match, but the context was important.
Yeah. And you could throw Argentina, Saudi Arabia into that as well, I think, from the last World Cup, because again, you've got your first World Cup that's being hosted in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia go and beat the team that were favourites to win. So, yeah, I'd throw that one in as well. So, yeah, those are all, I think, good examples.
I think we've mentioned the 1982 Brazil-Italy so many times, but besides that one, which match or matches on your list is the most talked about by historians and why?
Not specific match, but any of the Netherlands games from 74 because of the whole total football story. So Netherlands, Germany, and Netherlands, Argentina. Netherlands, Argentina is one I have in the book because they thrashed them 4-0, and that's probably the best demonstration of total football. But a lot of people then also talk about the final. But anything in 74 that's Holland related is, historians love to talk about that because, as I say, it was a seismic change in football, total football under Venus Meekles. You got Cruyff, you got Mayskins, you got Rep with that. The long hair, the love beads, all that. That's very iconic. Italy, Brazil, as you say. We've talked about Argentina, England, 86. That will always get discussed because of the whole Maradona of the game. Germany, Brazil, I think that 7-1 will get talked about a lot going forwards as one of those very seismic games. But yeah, I think you covered it on those. It's normally ones that cause a change, almost a change in football. And Holland 74 were like that. Italy, Brazil, because it changed the way Brazil approached football. That's a very important game for the ramifications later on. And Argentina, England, just because of the legacy of Maradona and being one of the most greatest players to play in the World Cup. And I'm sure as time goes on, the last World Cup final will kind of get that status because of Messi. So it's probably too soon now. But again, when people 10, 20 years from now start looking back at Messi like they did at Maradona, that game is going to come up again and again. The fact that that's when he finally won the World Cup, put in a fantastic performance. I also think it depends a little bit on your perspective. So, like we were saying, for me, England, West Germany, 1990 is a game that will, if I'm in England, is talked about a lot. There's whole books about that World Cup, as we talked about, is very revered in England, even though maybe it shouldn't be. Again, perspective, right? If you're Italian, they probably talk about Italy, South Korea more than most games, the 2002 one, because in their mind it was a huge conspiracy theory. Oh, sorry, a huge conspiracy. There are theories about it, and they've never really recovered from that. So I think it does depend on who you are. I probably for Americans, USA, Iran probably has quite an important place historically because of the politics around that game. So I think it's different depending which country you're from, as I say. But there are certain ones with like total football and Brazil there where they will always go down as part of history because they are actual key events within the development of the game.
Which matches are a classic, but personally you wanted the losing team to have won?
I actually thought about this. I wrote some down, and what was funny was it's nearly always against Germany. I have nothing against Germany, I really don't. But it just seems that they tend to be the ones that beat the romantic teams. So yeah, 74. I would have loved to have seen Cruyff and that team beat Germany in the final. I think they were one of the greatest teams not to win the World Cup, along with Brazil in '82. So there's that one as well. So those two, I think, were both fantastic teams who I would love to have seen win the World Cup. Obviously, as I mentioned, France against Germany, because I think that was a travesty and the whole Schumacher of it all. Obviously, France would have been much more deserving finalists. England against Germany in '90. I would have loved to have seen England win that game and get to a World Cup final. Same with probably Brazil, England. The 2002 one always bugs me because we were only 2-1 down and they were down to 10 men. And I just felt like we didn't go for it and we really should have gone for it. We had a chance and we were almost too scared to go for it. Ghana, I would have loved to have seen Ghana beat Uruguay just because to see an African team get to the semi-final at that time would have been so cool because no one had done it. And then, yeah, I mean, Germany, Brazil, I was rooting for Brazil in that World Cup because it was in their own nation, in front of their own fans. And to see them get humiliated like that, as I say, was extremely painful. But yeah, even though so many of them are Germany, they were deserved winners in each of those games. Can't argue against it. They're a very strong team. It's just that often they played teams, like a France or Netherlands, where I really wanted them. I would have loved to have seen them go further, but the Germans are efficient and they will beat you on any weakness. And fair play to them in each of those games. They were the deserved winners. But yeah, they're the ones that spring to mind where I would have liked to have seen the losing team win. But that's what makes football great. You can't. I mean, there are games like that where, and in a way, it's funny because you think about Netherlands in '74, they're almost more loved in a way because they lost. It's weird to say it. Same in a way with Brazil because you get this romance of. It's hard to explain, but like nobody really remembers Germany from '74. I mean, they were a great side with Gerd Muller and things, but people remember Holland more. And so sometimes when you go down as one of these great teams that didn't quite make it, you almost become more romantic in history and almost more beloved.
In closing, what do you want the reader to come away from reading your list of 50 matches?
I would love them to come away with an appreciation of what a great tournament the World Cup is. When you look at the fact that there are those 50 great matches, the beauty of the World Cup, in my mind, still, especially now, is that it's not as tainted by finances as regular football is. So, I mean, the issues with football now, modern football, is if you think about the Man Cities of the world and the Real Madrids, it's so influenced by money, and you can just buy yourself now. You can buy yourself a great team. I say that, but obviously it doesn't quite work like that. It still has to be a team. We saw that with the Galacticos of Real Madrid. But still, money buys you, can buy you success. The beauty of the World Cup is it's still every team, you're using players that are based in your country. You can't go out, if you don't have a good striker, you can't go out and buy a good striker. You have what you have and you have to make the best of it. So in a way, there's still a purity about the World Cup, I think, compared to club tournaments that is magical. I would love people to discover old tournaments that maybe were before their time and then learn more about those classic sides and players. Like I say, something like Denmark or Russia. It's great to learn about those. And the beauty is, hopefully what this does is introduce things that interest me. So someone might read the Danish one, say, or watch the highlights and go, wow, I didn't know about that. I'd love to learn more. And there are really great books that go into detail about that. So if you want to know more about the '90 World Cup, there's All Played Out. There's that classic book by Pete Davis. Fantastic. If you want to know about the Danish team, there's one, Danish Dynamite. That's a really, really good read. And I would say to someone who doesn't know, you don't want to jump straight into Danish Dynamite without any context because you won't get it. But if you do the research on the book and you find something that you're interested in, then go to the next stage. That's the beauty. You can go down and then dig deeper, and depending on what you find. Same with YouTube. Again, if you find somebody like the Soviet Union team that you find interesting, you can go. YouTube is a great rabbit hole. You can start going down and looking at Dynamo Kiev, and you start learning about Dynamo Kiev, and maybe get more interested in Russian football at that time and Dynamo Tbilisi. YouTube is a fantastic resource for that. And it's great for going down rabbit holes. I found it just when I was doing the research. You look at one game and suddenly you go off somewhere else, and it leads you to just a deeper experience. So yeah, I would hope that people would find things that they're attracted to in the book, find games they want to watch them, and then want to go deeper. Hopefully, it sets off a passion for games that maybe they don't know or never saw. And if you've seen them all, if you're my age and you saw them all, hopefully it just gives you a lot of good memories. And then again, some of the context that you might not have known. Again, you know, as I say, with Russia, I didn't completely understand straight away about the whole Dynamo Kiev Lobanovsky bit, but once I got into it, you know, it was really interesting to find out. So that's what I'd hope people would do. I'd hope that they get a taste of everything, and then what it hopefully does is sets off a passion. And as I say, that person with their 14-year-old, I love that story. Just the fact that he just read it from cover to cover was so racial. I mean, honestly, I'm not just saying this. If somebody ends up loving football because they read this book who didn't before, then I'm a happy person. I mean, that's what I want to do. I mean, we love this game, you and me both. We've watched it for years and years, and there's nothing better than watching a youngster get that same love. I've seen it with my boys. I'm always watching Premier League. They watch it with me, and I've seen them get a love of the game. And yeah, as a fan, that's the best thing you can do. So if the book helps encourage anybody to deeper and learn more about international football, then I'm a very happy person.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to Mr. Hoffman's book and other writings are on the blog and podcast uploads. So thank you once again.
Oh, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to come on and talk about it and relive a lot of memories. So no, thank you. And as I say, your video clips online are just absolutely fantastic, and you've done God's work in putting those up. I'll tell you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, all the best.
Thank you.